The individual responsible for collecting rent arrived on the initial Tuesday of November. His knocking was abrupt and persistent against the aged, uneven planks of the door. Eliza Brennan meticulously counted out the coins into his hand, her movements deliberately slow. Her daughter, Violet, observed from a corner where the ceiling sloped so sharply that an adult woman could not stand erect. The humble dwelling they occupied contained a crudely fashioned table marred with numerous knife etchings, 2 apple crates serving as seating, and a straw-filled mattress that all 3 shared, which perpetually carried the scent of mildew. Little else furnished the room. During colder periods, moisture would seep from the walls, leaving dark streaks that solidified into intricate patterns on the most frigid nights. Eliza's son, Aaron, who was 5 years old and notably small for his age, sat on the floor engrossed in mending a torn sack with a curved needle. His focus was absolute, his small hands expertly guiding the stitches with a dexterity that belied his years. Once the collector had departed, Eliza retrieved a leather pouch. It had been sent by her late husband's brother from the Eastern Territories. Within, she found $47 in various denominations of coin, alongside a folded deed detailing 17 acres of land situated in the highlands above Ashford Reach, a modest settlement bordered by the untamed wilderness. The accompanying letter described the property as rugged terrain, unsuitable for cultivation, and generally avoided by prudent individuals. Her husband's brother explained that he had acquired the deed through a card game and had no practical use for such remote real estate. Eliza read the letter again by the flickering candlelight. Meanwhile, Violet was occupied braiding rope from dried grass, and Aaron was diligently sorting through their limited supply of beans, discarding any that showed signs of weevil infestation. The following morning, she informed them of her decision to depart before the onset of heavy snows made travel impassable. She stated they would carry only what was essential and endeavor to establish a life on the seemingly barren land. Violet, who was 10 years old and possessed her father's steady hands, inquired solely about the necessary provisions. Aaron, without prompting, began gathering his few belongings into a bundle. Over a period of 3 days, Eliza liquidated their possessions, procured 2 woolen blankets, a crosscut saw, an axe, a small 4-piece iron stove, 20 pounds of seed potatoes, dried peas, cornmeal, salt pork, tallow candles, hemp rope, 3 tin plates, and a laying hen housed in a wicker crate. She retained her husband's tools and the leather satchel containing his surveying equipment. They set out from Ashford Reach on foot in the early hours, their belongings distributed amongst them and loaded onto a borrowed handcart. The townsfolk observed their departure from their doorways, offering no assistance, their expressions a mixture of pity and satisfaction. The path ascended gradually through stands of pine and leafless birch, the ground already hardened by an early frost that crunched underfoot and the wheels of the handcart. Violet, pulling the cart, navigated exposed roots and scattered stones without complaint. Her breathing grew heavier on the steeper inclines, but her pace remained consistent, her knuckles white as she gripped the worn wooden handles. Aaron walked beside his mother, his breath misting in the increasingly frigid air. He clutched the hem of her shawl when the path became steep or when loose rocks threatened his footing. They paused twice each day for rest and sustenance, seating themselves on fallen logs or flat stones, while Eliza distributed portions of cornbread she had prepared beforehand, along with strips of salt pork. The hen, confined to its cage, pecked at crumbs and emitted soft clucking sounds that seemed almost conversational. On the second day of their journey, they arrived in the cave country, a chaotic and rugged landscape of granite formations resembling the Earth's very skeletal structure. Frozen springs cascaded in icy curtains, and ancient trees, twisted by decades of wind resistance, bore the marks of their struggle in gnarled trunks and asymmetrical crowns. The ambient temperature here felt several degrees lower than in the lowlands, and the wind carried the mineral scent of deep earth and ancient rock. The cave itself opened into the side of a ridge, its entrance a vast opening, easily accommodating a wagon, framed by 2 immense boulders leaning together as if in conspiracy. The interior plunged into darkness that readily consumed the meager light from their single candle, its flame flickering erratically in a draught that seemed to emanate from within. Eliza stood at the threshold, her hand raised to shield the flame, feeling a subtle air movement against her palm. A growing excitement welled within her as she realized it was warm air, a gentle exhalation defying the November chill enveloping the highlands. She dispatched Violet to gather kindling and small branches from the pine trees near the cave's mouth. Eliza, meanwhile, began to assess the cave's dimensions, pacing out the space with deliberate steps. She employed her husband's measuring tape, stretching it between her hands and the cave walls, meticulously recording each measurement in his surveying notebook with a worn stub of pencil. The main chamber extended 40 feet from the entrance to the rear wall and measured 20 feet across at its widest point. The ceiling arched high overhead, allowing a tall man to walk upright anywhere within without fear of striking his head. The walls, when touched, were dry, exhibiting none of the dampness that afflicted many natural caves. The floor consisted of packed earth interspersed with fine sand, yielding slightly underfoot but appearing stable and well drained. At the back of the chamber, partially obscured by a natural fold in the rock face, she discovered the source of the warm air. A fissure approximately 6 inches wide, descending into the darkness beyond the candle's reach. A steady upward flow of warm air emerged, a phenomenon she recognized as a thermal vent connecting to subterranean heated chambers. The warmth was subtle yet persistent. Holding her hand above the fissure, she felt waves of heat rising, reminiscent of the air above a cooking stove. This explained why snow did not accumulate at the entrance, even when drifts outside reached considerable depths. It was also why the cave's interior temperature remained bearable, even as winter's icy grip tightened upon the surrounding land. She outlined her plan on the dirt floor using a pointed stick. Aaron, meanwhile, collected smooth stones from the cave floor, testing each for weight and texture before adding it to his growing assortment, meticulously stacking them into towers that he would patiently construct and reconstruct. That night, they slept within the cave for the first time, wrapped in their blankets near the thermal vent. Eliza remained awake for hours, listening to her children slumber, the wind outside, and formulating plans for the work that would commence with the dawn. She envisioned walls rising within the cave, windows that would admit light while repelling the cold, and a garden that would flourish, warmed by the earth's own heat. On their 4th day in the cave country, she felled the first tree, a straight pine, 60 feet tall, with bark the color of rust, and a trunk diameter she estimated at 18 inches. This task, accomplished with the crosscut saw, demanded a rhythmic and patient collaboration between 2 individuals. Violet matched her mother's strokes with the opposite handle, their combined effort causing the saw blade to bite into the pale wood with each pass, generating fragrant piles of sawdust at their feet. The tree's weight shifted subtly as the cut deepened until Eliza issued a warning. They stepped back as the pine tilted, suspended for a breathless moment before crashing to the ground, sending snow cascading from nearby branches and startling a pair of ravens into noisy flight. They limbed the tree together, using the axe and hatchet, working from the base upward, removing each branch flush with the trunk. They then measured and cut the trunk into manageable 12-foot lengths, marking each piece with the hatchet to maintain their sequence. Transporting these sections back to the cave required the rope and an understanding of leverage and friction, principles her husband had imparted years earlier on the farm they had lost to debt and drought. They secured the rope around one end of each log, looped it over a smoothly barked birch limb positioned as a pulley point, and used their combined weight to slide the heavy timber across the frozen ground, achieving distances of 50 feet in an hour at times, and less when the terrain proved resistant. Aaron diligently gathered pine branches for kindling, sorting them into bundles by thickness, the thinnest for ignition, the medium for sustained heat, and the thickest for overnight use in the stove. This arduous labor consumed 6 full days, from dawn until dusk. Their hands became raw, despite the gloves Eliza had provided, and their shoulders and backs ached each night as they rested near the thermal vent. Over the subsequent 2 weeks, they felled 12 more trees, carefully selecting each for straightness and absence of rot, examining the bark for signs of disease or insect damage, and choosing specimens that had grown in fertile soil with adequate sunlight. By the end of the 2nd week, they had amassed a considerable stack of logs beside the cave entrance. The bark remained attached, and the surfaces wept sap that froze into golden beads, requiring them to be chipped away before they could work the wood. Eliza commenced constructing the cabin framework inside the cave's mouth, positioned 6 feet back from the entrance to ensure adequate air circulation and to locate the structure in a zone where the cave's warmth met the external cold. Using a pickaxe borrowed from a reluctant tool merchant in Ashford Reach, she dug holes for the corner posts, penetrating the packed earth to reach more solid ground beneath. She measured the depth of each hole with a marked stick to guarantee level corners. The corner posts, 8-inch diameter logs stripped of bark and cut to an identical 8-foot length, were set into the holes and secured with smaller rocks wedged tightly and tamped earth packed down with the flat end of the axe. She meticulously cut notches, creating interlocking joints that would support the horizontal logs without the need for nails, which they could not afford. Each notch was shaped to precisely match the curve of the logs above and below. Her hands blistered, the blisters broke, and then calloused over, a testament to her persistent effort. Violet held each log steady while her mother worked, learning to anticipate the angle of the axe and the force of each swing. They raised the walls one course at a time, rolling the logs up temporary ramps fashioned from smaller poles, fitting them into the notches, and checking the level with a tool that had belonged to Eliza's husband. They sealed the gaps between the logs with moss gathered from the shaded northern faces of external rocks. This moss was mixed with clay excavated from the stream bank, and water carried in their wooden bucket, then pressed deep into every crevice where cold air might penetrate. Aaron made hundreds of trips to the clay bank, his bucket growing heavier as he learned to fill it more efficiently. His small boots wore a distinct path through the deepening snow, a testament to the week's passing. The cabin took shape with agonizing slowness, a 16-foot square structure with walls that rose course by course to a height of 7 feet at the lowest point and 8 feet at the corners. She framed a simple gable roof using smaller poles, notching and fitting them together. These were covered with split shingles painstakingly carved from cedar rounds using a froe and mallet, overlapping each row to ensure water runoff. They were secured with wooden pegs whittled during the evenings. The door was the next addition, constructed from planks she had split from a single large log, fitted together with wooden dowels, and reinforced with diagonal braces. It was hung on hinges fashioned from leather straps cut from an old belt and secured with hand-forged nails purchased at considerable expense. 2 window frames followed, rough rectangles cut through the walls at strategic positions to maximize incoming light. Each was covered with cloth that Eliza had oiled with rendered fat, rendering it translucent and weather-resistant. Inside, she assembled the iron stove from its 4 components, connecting them with bolts and ensuring each joint was sealed tightly. The stovepipe was carefully fitted into a hole she had chiseled through the cabin ceiling and routed up through the natural rock chimney above, with clay used to seal the gaps and prevent sparks from escaping into the dry wood. The entire undertaking consumed the entirety of November and half of December. Upon completion, they possessed a dwelling situated within the cave, akin to a ship in a bottle. It featured 4 solid walls and a roof that effectively shed the moisture that occasionally condensed on the cave ceiling above. The interior was warm and dry, offering a distinct sanctuary from the brutal cold that now gripped the highlands, with temperatures plummeting far below freezing each night. Eliza divided the cave floor according to the vision that had materialized during her first night's sleep. This plan had solidified in her mind with remarkable clarity and completeness. The thermal vent consistently warmed the entire chamber to a temperature hovering near 50 degrees Fahrenheit, verified with the mercury thermometer she had packed among their essential supplies, even as the world outside froze solid. She constructed raised beds from split logs, creating frames 8 inches high designed to contain the soil she intended to import. Each bed was carefully positioned to receive optimal illumination from the lantern, which would supplement the weak winter sun that barely penetrated the cave entrance. The beds extended along the cave's western wall, 6 rectangular frames in total, each measuring 4 feet in width and 12 feet in length. Their corners fit together using the same notching technique she had employed on the cabin walls. She and Violet transported earth from the lowlands in woven baskets, making repeated trips down the trail to a location where a stream had deposited rich alluvial soil in a wide, flat area. Each load, weighing approximately 40 pounds, had to be carried nearly half a mile over challenging terrain. They mixed this imported soil with composted pine needles gathered from beneath the trees near the cave. This material had decomposed into a crumbly brown substance that would enhance drainage and provide essential nutrients. Later, when they acquired animals, they would incorporate manure to further enrich the beds. The task of filling all 6 beds required 2 weeks of labor. Their backs ached from the constant bending and lifting, and their hands remained permanently stained brown from the soil. She planted the seed potatoes in 3 of the beds, cutting each potato into pieces containing at least 2 eyes. The cut surfaces were allowed to dry for a day before the pieces were placed 6 inches deep in the soil, covered with a layer of straw for insulation against temperature fluctuations and to retain moisture. The remaining 3 beds were designated for spring greens and root vegetables to be planted later. On the eastern side of the cave, she constructed a pen from split rails, creating a rectangular enclosure measuring roughly 10 feet by 15 feet, ample space to comfortably house several sheep without overcrowding. She lined the floor with straw purchased in town, creating a thick layer for cushioning and waste absorption. A manger, fashioned from scrap wood, and a water trough carved from a hollow log using the axe and a curved knife were installed. She worked the interior of the trough smooth to prevent splinters from harming the animals' mouths. The trough required 3 full days of carving and sanding, but once completed, it held water without leaking and possessed a lip height suitable for both adult sheep and lambs. In town, at the livestock market, held each Saturday, she traded $2 silver for 3 ewes, young animals with good fleece and strong legs, described by the seller as healthy and proven breeders. She led them up the trail using rope halters she had braided herself from hemp, walking slowly to accommodate their pace. Violet carried Aaron on her back over the steepest sections where his short legs would have struggled. The sheep settled into their pen as if they had always resided there, unfazed by the stone ceiling above, the shared space with the cabin, or the unusual circumstance of living indoors. They grazed contentedly on hay Eliza had purchased from a farmer in the lowlands. The dried timothy and clover still retained a sweet aroma despite their winter storage. Within days they thrived in the cave's steady warmth, their wool growing thick and soft, their eyes bright and alert. Aaron appointed himself their shepherd without being asked, checking their water trough twice daily, refilling it from buckets he carried from the spring, scratching their woolly heads, and speaking to them in soft tones. He began to recognize each sheep by subtle differences in their markings and the sounds they made. Violet tended the garden beds with equal dedication, eagerly anticipating the first green shoots of potato plants with an almost obsessive anticipation. She watered the soil when it felt dry and adjusted the lanterns to provide what she believed was optimal light. Eliza focused on refining their living space. Shelves constructed from leftover planks were mounted to the cabin walls to hold their provisions. She organized their supplies of cornmeal, salt pork, and dried beans into a logical system that allowed her to track consumption and plan for resupply. She built a proper table from planks she had split and planed smooth, a surface large enough for all 3 to gather around for meals, accompanied by 3-legged stools that would sit level even on the slightly uneven cabin floor. Wooden pegs were carved from birch branches and driven into the cabin walls at strategic heights for hanging tools, garments, and the coils of rope they seemed to accumulate. She rendered tallow from the fat saved from their salt pork, melting it slowly over the stove and pouring it into molds fashioned from rolled bark, creating candles that burned cleaner and longer than the inexpensive ones they had brought from town. She constructed a small loom from birch saplings, notching and tying them into a frame that would enable her to weave simple cloth. She began teaching Violet the patterns and techniques, emphasizing how to maintain tension and how to pass the shuttle, skills that would serve the girl throughout her life. The cave transformed into a self-contained world, insulated from the winter storms raging outside, illuminated by lantern light and the warm glow of the stove. It was warmed by the earth's own breath rising from the fissure, filled with the gentle sounds of sheep rustling in the straw and water dripping from unseen recesses and the rhythmic click of Violet's shuttle on the loom. When Eliza traveled to town for supplies in late December, leading one sheep to sell for cash, the townsfolk gathered to observe her passage. They were aware of her dwelling on the cave land, the cabin she had built within the stone, and her attempt to cultivate during winter. The blacksmith derided it as madness, proclaiming the cave would collapse and crush them all. The preacher's wife deemed it unnatural, asserting that warmth in winter was the devil's work. The merchant who supplied her cornmeal and salt questioned her sanity, suggesting she was squandering her inheritance on worthless rock. Eliza listened without comment, paid for her goods, and walked back up the trail with her purchases in a pack. Violet inquired why the townspeople spoke such cruel words. Eliza explained that people often fear what they do not understand, and that fear can breed meanness. She assured Violet they would demonstrate the value of their endeavors not through arguments, but through tangible results. Aaron, with a touch of apprehension, asked if the cave would indeed fall down. Eliza pointed to the vaulted ceiling, explaining how the arch distributed weight and how stone that had endured for millennia would not fail now. That night, she added a second window to the cabin, desiring more light, and reinforced the garden beds with cross braces. She carefully examined the flock and found them robust and well-fed, their fleece growing thick. The potato plants had already emerged, delicate emerald shoots reaching skyward towards the artificial glow. She sowed seeds for both kale and turnips in the remaining cultivated patches, providing them with water from her buckets, and then covered the earth with a layer of straw to conserve moisture. Violet lent a hand in constructing a drying framework for herbs and root vegetables, while Aaron diligently learned the art of carding wool, employing a pair of brushes Eliza herself had crafted from wood and bent nails. The industrious effort continued without interruption, each completed chore naturally leading to the commencement of the next, and the cavern became imbued with the comforting aromas of soil, livestock, and simmering meals. The arrival of January ushered in a frigid spell so intense that the surrounding trees fractured with sounds akin to artillery fire. Snow accumulated in vast drifts, obscuring the cave's opening to a depth of 4 feet, necessitating Eliza's daily excavation of a passage to maintain their connection with the external world. Within the shelter of the cave, the temperature remained consistently above 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The sheep grew plumper, the cultivated plots thrived, and the dwelling remained sufficiently warm that they no longer required their heavy winter garments for slumber. Eliza continuously refined their established routines, fine-tuning the stove's airflow to maximize heat output while minimizing fuel consumption, strategically repositioning the lamps to provide optimal illumination for the plants, and regularly turning the sheep's bedding to ensure it stayed dry. She began instructing Violet in the process of milking the ewes, even though they were not yet at their peak production, and in discerning the subtle indications of illness or distress in the animals. To Aaron, she imparted the knowledge of identifying edible flora by referencing illustrations in a volume that had once belonged to her husband, and he diligently practiced inscribing their names onto a slate with a piece of chalk. Their lives settled into a predictable pattern, mirroring the cave's constant comforting exhalation, waking with the radiating warmth from the thermal vents, working through the abbreviated daylight hours of winter, and drifting off to sleep accompanied by the sound of the wind outside and the gentle stirring of the sheep in their enclosure. In early February, Eliza commenced the shearing of the sheep, utilizing hand shears to meticulously remove their dense wool, which she and Violet then washed in heated water and spread upon the racks to dry. The fleece proved to be fine and abundant, sufficient for bartering for necessities they were unable to produce themselves. Aaron assisted in transporting it, his small hands deftly and carefully arranging it into soft mounds. Eliza made preparations for a second expedition to the town in March, anticipating that the roads would be traversable once more. She meticulously compiled a list of their requirements: additional seeds, nails, a second pail for milk, sugar, coffee, and needles for sewing. She then calculated the potential earnings from the wool and the anticipated revenue from their initial vegetable harvest. The figures indicated a strong likelihood of survival, perhaps even a degree of prosperity, provided the cave continued to offer its remarkable warmth, and their diligent efforts consistently yielded satisfactory results. A formidable storm descended on the first Monday of March, a blizzard that transformed the sky into a uniform white expanse and plunged the temperature to levels Eliza had never personally encountered. Beyond the cave's entrance, the landscape became utterly unrecognizable. Trees vanished beneath the accumulating snow, familiar pathways were obliterated, and even the sun was obscured by clouds that appeared as though forged from iron. Inside, however, They remained secure. Yet, Eliza harbored concerns for the inhabitants of the town below, many of whom resided in dwellings no more substantial than the one she had abandoned, possessing walls that allowed heat to escape and stoves that consumed fuel at an unsustainable rate. She envisioned families huddled together in single rooms, resorting to burning their furniture for warmth and meticulously rationing dwindling provisions that would not sustain them until spring. Violet inquired if those who had once ridiculed them were now enduring hardships. Eliza confirmed their strong probability of suffering, adding that compassion should be extended regardless of the recipient's past behavior. In that moment, standing within the cavern's comforting warmth with her children and her flourishing garden and healthy livestock, she resolved to transport provisions to the town once the tempest subsided, to share the bounty harvested from their improbable sanctuary with those who had dismissed her endeavors as folly. Violet voiced her opinion that the townspeople did not merit assistance. Eliza gently countered that aid was not contingent upon worthiness, but rather on the capacity to provide it. Aaron remained silent, but he began selecting the most robust turnips and the healthiest kale from the garden beds. The storm raged for 4 days. Upon its cessation, the snow had accumulated so high that Eliza required 2 hours of strenuous effort to carve an exit tunnel. She meticulously loaded a sled with vegetables, cured mutton from a sheep she had butchently slaughtered in February, and a sack of wool. Violet and Aaron joined her in hauling it down the path, the runners of the sled hissing against the compacted snow, their exhalations forming white plumes in the brilliant, frigid sunlight. Ashford Reach presented a scene reminiscent of a settlement under siege. Smoke emanated from only half the chimneys, and the thoroughfares were deserted, save for a few men laboriously transporting firewood on sleds. Eliza proceeded directly to the parsonage, aware that 3 families had congregated there, seeking refuge from the cold. She rapped on the door, and as the preacher's wife opened it, Eliza observed a room populated by pallid faces and heard the faint sounds of children coughing. Without preamble, she offered the contents of her sleds, stating she had additional provisions if needed. The preacher's wife gazed at the vegetables as if witnessing a miracle, tears welling in her eyes. She questioned how such produce could exist in March amidst the harsh grip of winter. Eliza attributed their success to the warmth of their dwelling and the fertility of their soil, acknowledging their considerable good fortune. The preacher himself then appeared at the doorway, the very man who had deemed the cave unnatural, and he expressed his gratitude with a voice that trembled. Eliza then made her way throughout the town, distributing food to families she knew were facing adversity, accepting no remuneration beyond heartfelt expressions of thanks. The blacksmith, who had previously predicted the cave's imminent collapse, offered to repair her tools gratuitously. The merchant presented her with a bag of coffee, refusing any payment. By the time she returned to the cave that evening, guiding the empty sled with Violet and Aaron by her side, the sun had begun its descent and the temperature was once again plummeting. However, a perceptible shift had occurred in the atmosphere. The townspeople had witnessed tangible evidence of her endeavors, had savored the taste of vegetables cultivated in the warmth of winter, and had experienced the superior quality of wool shorn in February. They now understood that the cave represented not madness, but rather ingenious resourcefulness, and that the mother and her children had achieved something truly remarkable. Violet inquired if the townspeople would now be more amicable. Eliza expressed her hope for such a change, but emphasized its ultimate insignificance, as their actions had been morally justifiable regardless of the outcome. The remainder of March was characterized by consistent, productive labor. The snow gradually receded, revealing the skeletal forms of the forest, and the days noticeably lengthened. Eliza replenished the garden beds with additional seeds, implementing crop rotation to maintain soil health. In early April, the sheep gave birth to 2 healthy lambs, whom Aaron christened and cared for with profound devotion. Violet acquired the skill of spinning wool on a drop spindle Eliza had expertly fashioned from birch, producing yarn of sufficient fineness for knitting. They began formulating plans for the approaching spring, expanding the cultivated areas, constructing a more substantial shelter outside the cave for the warmer months, acquiring additional sheep, and potentially investing in a dairy cow if their finances permitted. Eliza commenced instructing Violet in the operation of her late husband's surveying instruments. demonstrating techniques for measuring angles and calculating distances, skills that might prove invaluable in the future. To Aaron, she taught the fundamentals of numbers and letters using the chalk and slate, and he absorbed this knowledge with the same quiet focus he applied to all his tasks. The cave continued to serve as their central hub, a sanctuary of warmth and security, a testament to the power of innovation and hard work to surmount challenging circumstances. Eliza harbored no inclination to boast or to make the townspeople feel diminished for their prior ridicule. She had achieved what needed to be demonstrated, and that was sufficient. When visitors from Ashford Reach arrived in late April, drawn by accounts of the cave farm, she welcomed them warmly and elucidated the function of the thermal vent, explaining the principles of heat retention and the advantages afforded by stone construction. She generously shared seeds and offered valuable counsel. Some of the visitors departed with a sense of humility, while others were demonstrably inspired. Eliza treated all with the same patient courtesy and unwavering willingness to assist. By May, the highlands had been transformed into a vibrant tapestry of verdant grasses and wild blossoms. The garden beds yielded an abundant harvest, and Eliza embarked on the process of preserving vegetables in earthenware jars, storing them meticulously on shelves within the cabin. The sheep grazed outdoors during the daylight hours and returned to their enclosure each night. Violet had grown taller, her hands now possessing a dexterity comparable to her mother's, and she worked with the assurance of someone who had actively contributed to the creation of something tangible. Aaron diligently tended to the lambs and honed his ability to distinguish between edible and inedible plants. The cave had provided them with more than mere shelter. It had furnished them with a solid foundation, a place from which they could construct a life according to their own aspirations. Eliza found herself seated outside the cave entrance one evening in late May, observing the sun dip below the distant ridges. Violet sat beside her, engaged in mending a sock, while Aaron slept peacefully with his head resting in Eliza's lap. Her thoughts drifted to her husband, wishing he could witness what they had created from seemingly barren land and an inheritance that most would have squandered. She reflected on the winter that had tested their resilience and on the townspeople they had aided despite facing derision. She felt no sense of triumph, only a quiet contentment derived from fulfilled obligations and principles upheld. The cave exhaled its warm, comforting air into the cool spring evening, and within its confines the garden beds awaited their next sowing. The sheep rustled softly in their pen. The stove emitted a gentle ticking sound as it cooled. Everything was in its designated place. All was as it ought to be. And Eliza Brennan, with her children by her side, and the vast, wild expanse of the land stretching out before them, understood with certainty that they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, for they had learned to cultivate warmth in the bleakest of seasons and to extend it generously to those in greatest need.